Greetings. Welcome to Anti-Liars, where we always seek the truth and dispel the lies. I am your host, Howard Self. Since we started this channel, Anti-Liars has created podcast videos whose purpose was to lay out facts, dates, documents, court outcomes, and providential principles that sadly many members of the Unification movement were never allowed to hear. The overwhelming response to Anti-Liars has been very telling. Our videos have thousands of views. There have been only a relative handful of negative comments. What this tells me is that the great majority of you watching our podcast are very sincere people who want to know the truth behind the schism and the reasons for the continuing collapse of the Unification Church. These videos were intended for sincere members of faith of the larger movement who remain committed to the messianic providential mission that Reverend Sun Myung Moon was leading, and which was the main reason that led you to join the movement. Of course, I understand that many may still have questions. It is natural to process the truth as you hear it. You may not agree with everything right away. That is fine. After all, the unprincipled schism has now been going on for nearly 20 years. Honest and sincere questions are most welcome. However, there is another small group that appears to have a different motivation. A small number of insincere, agenda-driven commenters show up video after video, repeating the same stale accusations, factional slogans, and propaganda without even engaging a single fact presented in the video. They are not asking questions in good faith. They are not really seeking truth. They are using this space as a platform to promote themselves, defend their losing faction, protect a demonstrably failed narrative, or run cover for people and institutions that are collapsing under the weight of their own corruption and treachery. These people have an axe to grind and evidently way too much time to burn. To those people, I want to say, these videos are not for you. Our side has no interest in appeasing or trying to cater to the Unification Church or Sanctuary Church invested factions, because as far as we are concerned, those individuals failed in their responsibility of aligning to God's providence. The Anti-Liars videos are not meant to induce you to come to our side. They are intended to inform everyone of the truth and to serve as a historical record. The future of the Unification movement is actually in greenfield people who come from all faiths. The only reason we are reaching out to members of the Unification Church is because Dr. Hyunjin Moon instructed us to be our brother's keepers, as the Bible had guided. Although UC members were in the first position, because of their treasonous betrayal of God, of Reverend Moon, and of Dr. Moon, they are now in the last position. That's why we are making these efforts. For those UC members asking about the future of the movement, you are not the future of the movement. You carry the baggage of UC, and your providential understanding was completely wrong. In today's video, I am going to answer several recurring points this one time in this one place. After this video, I will not address these points again. Now, let's go to the first point. There were comments asking, what do you mean by a charismatic, providential, messianic movement? Doesn't that negate the blessed central families? Why do we have to follow anyone? Why can't we just run the movement however we want? This, to me, is the most ignorant yet most repeated question raised, coming from people in the movement who do not understand the divine principle or the providential core of our movement. Throughout all of providential history, and especially from the biblical history of the Old Testament and New Testament, we see that God works through central figures and central families to advance his providence. It is no different in the present day providence. The word charismatic does not mean a personality cult, and it does not mean a dynasty doing as it pleases. The description is coupled with the words providential and messianic. Providential means God is the center. Messianic means that in the Unification movement, it is believed that Reverend Sun Myung Moon is an Adamic figure and that God's providence moves through that Adamic position. It means that the fruit that was born through his lineage is what God yearned to establish on earth throughout biblical history. The establishment of the true family is the purpose for which Reverend Moon came and the conclusion of the divine principle. The true family is the central institution of the movement. That is not my personal opinion or my preference. It is undisputed if you accept the principled view outlined in the divine principle and in Reverend Moon's teachings. This does not in any way negate the blessed central families. It actually does the opposite. It places more responsibility on blessed central families because the foundation, success, and settlement of the true family rest on the blessed central families. When I talk about empowering blessed families, I mean aligning them to God's providence, which is rooted in his truth and his dominion. I use the word alignment on purpose because every one of us has free will. Nobody is dragging you anywhere. You freely align or you don't. I have already explained numerous times that Reverend Moon designated his son, Dr. Hyunjin Moon, as his true and only successor, while also recognizing him as the fourth Adam. In other words, he is an Adamic figure of Reverend Moon's own caliber that carries on the messianic mantle into the next generation. Reverend Moon never intended for church leaders to determine what the providential prerogatives are and to lead the movement. He intended his own flesh and blood to do so. Think of it in biblical terms. We are a charismatic, messianic, providential movement that is forward-looking, that passes the baton to the next generation within the true family, and whose members align with the Adamic figure who leads the movement in advancing God's providence. The Unification Schism took place because church leaders purposefully chose to reject God's providence, Reverend Moon's vision, as well as rejecting the significance of the true family, which is the central institution of our faith. They chose not to align with the Adamic figure and next generation. The blessing does not come from a church institution. It comes from the true family because it is the inheritance of God's true blood lineage. Empowering blessed families does not mean turning them loose to invent their own version of the providence or to interpret Reverend Moon's teachings however they want to. Blessed central families were never meant to be passive spectators or obedient donation machines. They were meant to become owners of God's providence by aligning themselves, their conscience, their family, their mission, and their work in fulfilling God's original will as guided and led by an Adamic figure, instead of bending God's will to fit their own purposes. When we talk about a providential movement, understand that we, the members, are the realization of the providential promise of the Old and New Testaments. Therefore, everything the movement does is about the fulfillment of God's will. No one understands that better than the Adamic figure, who is God's Son. Although as members we were blessed by Reverend Moon, we know we are fallen people, and the blessing is conditional upon our fulfilling the expectation of heaven, which we failed to do. We should not delude ourselves into thinking that we have any consequence in the eyes of heaven. We really only have value when we align ourselves and our families to heaven's will centered upon the Adamic figure. Jesus, as an Adamic figure, said, quote, "No one comes to the Father except through me," unquote. John 14:6. So too is the fulfillment of God's will through our alignment to the third and fourth Adams. The person who decides the main path to fulfilling God's providence and guides the movement in that path is the Adamic figure. He comes from the true family, is within God's direct dominion, and is striving to be an example for all. Here is the part some of you have not wanted to hear. When you say, "Why can't we just have the movement however we want?" you should already know the answer. The movement is not a club that exists to reflect your preferences. God is at the center, and it is God's providence working through an Adamic messianic figure within the true lineage that God took thousands of years of biblical history to establish. That is Principle 101. Blessed central families come from fallen lineage, and we are engrafted to the true tree of life through the true family by receiving the blessing. We stand in the position of Cain in relation to the true children, who stand in the position of Abel. Our responsibility as Cain is to voluntarily submit to and reconcile with Abel. That is our role as Cain-type figures. And we also have the role of being the John the Baptist to the messianic figure. We were called by God to be advocates of the Adamic figure and his messianic mission. Reverend Moon said, "Since you were born as sons and daughters of the archangel, in order to enter the position where you can become sons, you must, from the position of adopted children, attend the direct lineage son as the eldest son, and attend the direct lineage son as your elder brother." Here is another quote from Reverend Moon. "A person in the position of Cain must completely unite with the true parents and true children who are in the position of Abel. By doing so, they are able to receive the benefit of restored children." At the end of the day, this is not about me or you. Because we come from fallen lineage, we are all fallen people. The most essential grace we were given was the blessing, which allowed us to come under God's direct dominion conditionally, meaning that we have to fulfill the expectation of aligning with the Adamic figure. Only then can we fulfill those roles. And to the commenter who says our failures trace back to a lack of codified structure and too much obedience, you are half right, and you drew the wrong lesson from it. Rules and accountability matter, and the absence of them is exactly how a corrupt clerical class hijacked the Unification Church and bled the members dry. But the cure for bad shepherds is not to throw out the providential Adamic center and hand the movement to a group of fallen, corrupt, and inept leaders and members of that church who have no connection to heaven or God's will. The cure is to align with the proper center, which in this case is with the fourth Adam, Dr. Hyunjin Moon, and his family, as Father has instructed. Reverend Moon told members, leaders, and even members of the true family in no uncertain terms that they must unite with his son, Dr. Hyunjin Moon. He said, "Only Hyunjin's children are the fourth generation. They are the fourth generation. That's why you can receive the era of the fourth Adam through Hyunjin's family." This very important quote is from Reverend Moon's words during Dr. Hyunjin Moon's inauguration ceremony in July 1998. And he went on, "Now the age of inheritance has come. The age of mother-son cooperation was the age of indemnity. However, once the way of father-son relationship is established afterward, mother should also follow the anointed elder son." From Reverend Moon's sermons, December 2000. And again, when speaking to the true children, "Since your brother Hyunjin is leading the way, you have to treat him with an absolute standard. You cannot compare him to Injin, Yejin, Hyojin, or Sungjin. You should absolutely obey Hyunjin. I put him in my place. You have to know this." From Reverend Moon's sermons, June 2000. A consistent principle throughout providential history is that God's providence is led by individuals and families, not by a church institution, by its members, or by church leaders. This is ever more so the case when Reverend Moon established the first true family in providential history. While members and leaders may have missions in terms of administration, education, and service in alignment with the true family, they are not the ones who inherit the authority to lead a messianic providential movement. Reverend Moon repeatedly emphasized that the movement developed through father-son leadership and father-son cooperation, with members and leaders supporting and uniting with the Son whom God had prepared to lead the providence and to inherit the messianic mantle. Reverend Moon addressed this issue directly in October of 2000, using then church president Sunjo Hwang as an example. Although Hwang occupied the highest leadership position in the Unification Church, Reverend Moon made clear that organizational leadership could not supersede the providential role of his own son. He stated that members should not ultimately center on church officials, but should unite with his son, Dr. Hyunjin Moon, and through him and his family come to true parents. But the UC leadership stood in opposition to this direction. Rather than upholding and uniting with Reverend Moon's directives in the era of father-son cooperation, many Unification Church leaders increasingly separated members from the very son whom Reverend Moon had instructed them to follow, while consolidating authority within the institutional leadership itself. As a result, members were often directed to place primary trust in organizational leaders rather than in the father-son framework that Reverend Moon identified as central to the providence. The following passage illustrates both Reverend Moon's explicit instruction and the extent to which later church leadership departed from that direction. Reverend Moon said, "Wang Sung-jo will not be able to take overall responsibility going forward. Since my sons and daughters exist and are crossing over while following along, shouldn't you follow my sons and daughters? Do you understand? Therefore, in the spirit world, Hungjinim is being sent together with the archangel, and on earth you must now unite, centering on Hyunjin. Therefore, you must unite centering on Hyunjin's family, and in that way, through his family, you can come to parents together with them." From Reverend Moon's Sermons, October 6, 2000. I am now going to address the often repeated claims that Hyunjinim stole the money, that he is a criminal, that Reverend Moon commanded him to return the assets. This false narrative was pushed continuously upon the larger movement. I have heard this untrue statement from both the sanctuary side and from the church side, almost word for word, for many years. Let me address it for good right now. First of all, why does this lie exist at all? It was repeated for years and spoon-fed to members as propaganda because it was useful to the corrupt leadership to undermine Dr. Hyunjin Moon and hijack major movement assets, not because it was true. Recasting a question of providential succession as a simple property dispute kept members angry and looking the other way. It turned Reverend Moon's own innocent son into the main villain. The same leadership class that bled Japan dry and rewrote the theology on its way to presiding over the UC collapse got to pose as the fake guardians of the movement's assets. A classic misdirection, which most members swallowed hook, line, and sinker. The theft story required forged evidence to appear to be true. Leaders inside the Family Federation manufactured documents and memos and put them in front of the courts. Mrs. Han herself, under oath, testified that true parents never saw many of the documents that bore their name and never approved them. The propaganda against Dr. Hyunjin Moon rests totally on false accusations. And please consider this. How can Dr. Hyunjin Moon steal anything if Reverend Moon himself asked Dr. Moon to be in charge of all the movement's businesses and assets? Who are the ones who actually stole the assets and disobeyed Reverend Moon's directives? Why do you not put the onus on the real wrongdoers and scammers? Why do you think the church is going through hell right now? It's because God will not allow these UC leaders, who are the actual criminals, to get away with the theft of the movement's assets. Heavenly judgment is raining upon them, and still you are accusing the true owner and heir. To understand what happened to the movement's assets, it is first necessary to understand the financial reality that Reverend Moon was trying to change. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Japanese church was raising approximately $300 million every year. From the late 2000s onwards, this huge amount of money flowed into the Mission Foundation in Korea. This was the exact opposite of Reverend Moon's vision. The movement's businesses were supposed to generate the profits necessary to finance the worldwide providence, relieving the Japanese members of the crushing burden they had carried for decades. Instead, the members continued subsidizing the businesses year after year, while the businesses failed to support the providence. Reverend Moon regarded this as one of the movement's major unresolved problems. That is why, beginning shortly after Dr. Moon graduated from Harvard Business School, Reverend Moon repeatedly asked him to take responsibility for the movement's business foundation and transform it into a self-sustaining economic base. The objective was not simply to improve corporate performance, but to fulfill Reverend Moon's long-standing promise to end the dependence on continual fundraising from Japanese members by creating businesses that would finance the providence through their own success. Further, Reverend Moon asked his son to rationalize all the movement's assets and businesses under a single international foundation that Dr. Moon himself would oversee, so those businesses could finally generate the profits that advanced God's providence. Against that backdrop, consider what ultimately happened under the hand of the Unification Church leadership, including Sean Moon, Kukjin Moon, Mrs. Han, and church officials aligned with them. Rather than realizing Reverend Moon's vision of lifting the financial burden from the members, donation requests were increased, and funds from Japanese donations that were meant to go to UCI for Dr. Moon to develop the businesses to support the providence were actually redirected into the Mission Foundation in Korea, with Mrs. Han serving as its official legal head. UC entities and the leadership that controlled them are now at the center of the criminal investigations and court proceedings in Japan and South Korea. The assets that had been placed beyond the control of the church bureaucracy were preserved. The assets that remained under the control of the institutional leadership became the financial foundation of the very system now exposed in courtrooms in Tokyo and Seoul. The historical record therefore raises an unavoidable question. Who demonstrated faithful stewardship of Reverend Moon's vision to free the movement from perpetual fundraising and abuse? And who squandered the sacrifices of the members while perpetuating the very system Reverend Moon and Dr. Moon sought to reform? Ask the harder question. What would the assets that Dr. Moon protected, the very assets they covet, look like today if they had stayed in the hands of the same UC leadership class that is now under criminal investigation in Korea? You already know the answer. They would have been completely wiped out, just as every asset is being wiped out in America, Korea, Japan, and other countries as well. 15 years of litigation have already answered this issue. The church lost decision after decision, appeal after appeal. If any of the cases against Dr. Moon were as airtight as they kept insisting, the UC would have prevailed somewhere along the way. It has prevailed nowhere. And look at the scoreboard. It's 100-0. Dr. Moon's side won all of the lawsuits the church launched because in the world outside of the delusional UC bubble, a narrative needs facts behind it, and their facts never held up to any scrutiny because they were manufactured. The only ones who believed them are the self-righteous people living inside that delusional bubble. The UC leadership's legal failures are a reflection of who they are and how they lied. That is the historical record. Now, set Dr. Moon's track record beside the church's own record. The church finds itself engulfed in corruption scandals across Korea and Japan, drowning in the kind of incompetence and malfeasance that in plain language looks a great deal like theft. The only assets that are actually protected right now are the ones under Dr. Moon's purview. They are the only ones being not only protected, but further developed and advanced for the providential purposes they were created to serve. One pattern that repeats itself in the work and life of Dr. Moon is that he brings about incredible progress and creates value in the face of overwhelming challenges and attacks. It is undeniable that God and the winds of heavenly fortune are with him. One clear example on the business front is the Park One project in Korea. In that case, Dr. Moon carried forward his father's vision of establishing Seoul as a major center of international finance in Asia and helped bring to completion what became one of the most significant financing achievements in Korean history. The creation of the multi-billion-dollar Park One complex required success on several difficult fronts at once. The team engaged in that project had to navigate the highly competitive and technically demanding worlds of project development, large-scale financing, construction, and management. At the same time, Dr. Moon also had to withstand and ultimately prevail in years of litigation brought by UC leadership against the project, a legal battle that reached the Korean Supreme Court. Even under those circumstances, Dr. Moon enabled the project to succeed. The scale of that achievement is difficult to overstate, and for most members, it is hard to comprehend. During the period of the schism, Dr. Moon continued to advance major providential and development efforts despite sustained and intense opposition. Dr. Moon is actually fulfilling the very dreams his father carried his entire life. He has built a real movement for Korean reunification around the vision of the Korean dream, grounded in Korea's own founding ideal of Hongik Ingan, to live for the benefit of all humanity. Through the Global Peace Foundation, he has carried peace work to continent after continent, bringing rival faiths to the same table and doing the hard work of reconciliation in places the rest of the world has given up on. Dr. Moon has championed strong families and character education as the foundation of a healthy society, and he has advanced the vision of one family under God across continents from Asia to the Americas. And that is only the start of the list. Dr. Moon's track record speaks for itself. Is it any wonder that things under the Family Federation and its current leadership are going to ruin? A large part of the reason is the very system Sean and Kukjin built when they ran the Family Federation. So you should think very hard before you type the word thief. You are ignoring a mountain of evidence stacked high against your own leaders. The real theft and malfeasance sitting inside your own organizations that you choose to ignore, while you keep recycling a narrative about Dr. Moon that has been proven absolute false. Repeating that he stole anything at this point crosses the line into defamation. If anyone in this story stole, it was the Unification Church leadership that took everything from the rightful heir, the son Reverend Moon personally asked to take charge of all the businesses and assets of the movement. By supporting the UC leadership, you are aiding and abetting those criminals in their treacherous acts against heaven. Next, I want to address the sanctuary crowd who are blindly following Sean and Kukjin. I am going to be blunt with you, sanctuary members, because being polite until now has not worked. Several of the sanctuary followers post the same lines under every video we create. Some of the recurring comments include, Hyunjin rejected Reverend Moon. He teamed up with Reverend Chung Hwan Kwak. Reverend Moon called Reverend Kwak the new Satan. Sean is the second king. It is obvious from the content of these comments that some of you never even watched any of the videos you are commenting on. You are not raising any argument. You are regurgitating your own talking points. For those of you who follow Sean, you are not the intended audience for our video. You walked away from the Providential Center and are following a man who calls himself king with a crown of bullets. But Sean and Kukjin were never the heirs of anything. They were the manufactured Frankenstein of Mrs. Han and the church leaders, who used them as attack dogs against their older brother, Dr. Moon. Afterwards, they were discarded when they were no longer needed. They were the useful idiots of the satanic clerical class that destroyed Reverend Moon's marriage with Mrs. Han, destroyed his family, and brought about the Unification Schism. The false narrative that Sean and Kukjin spewed was the same narrative that the cabal used in every lawsuit against Dr. Moon, whose evidentiary material was rejected wholeheartedly by every court in Korea, Japan, the United States, and other jurisdictions. They also pushed that narrative through heavy media propaganda campaigns, which today are likewise thoroughly rejected. It was propaganda to attack and steal from Dr. Moon that which was not meant for them. Sanctuary Church people should realize that Sean and Kukjin are a meme and a mockery. You are the poster child of every negative cliche that mocked the movement that Reverend Moon created. Your support is what gave Sean and Kukjin the so-called legitimacy to completely mischaracterize our movement to the rest of the world. You should be ashamed of yourselves. That's how society looks upon your sanctuary church. You're completely off track, following a cult-like operation that Sean and Kukjin lead. You still use Reverend Moon's name and quote his speeches as if they somehow justify you. But spiritually and providentially, you are totally off the path. You don't need to watch the anti-liars videos. They are clearly not meant for you. The New Testament repeatedly warns believers that in the last days, forces would arise to oppose God's work and deceive even sincere followers. Jesus warned us, saying, "For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive." Matthew 24:24. Describing those who depart from the truth and oppose God's anointed work, John the Apostle wrote, "This is the last hour, and as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come. This is how we know it is the last hour." 1 John 2:18. The greatest threats to God's providence often arise from within the community of faith, where spiritual authority can be challenged through distortion, division, and deception. Sean and Kukjin's actions should be evaluated in light of these biblical warnings. They are the Antichrist who came to distort, divide, and deceive people away from the true messianic Adamic figure. One of the clearest examples is their attempt to frame their relationship with their elder brother, Dr. Moon, through the lens of Cain and Abel. This reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of the divine principle. The Cain-Abel framework arose as a restoration formula because of the fall, when Adam's family established a four-position foundation centered on Satan. It exists to restore fallen humanity under Satan's dominion back to God. The true family, however, stands on an entirely different foundation. Reverend Moon taught that the true family established a four-position foundation centered on God and existing within God's direct dominion. Consequently, applying the Cain-Abel paradigm to relationships within the true family confuses a restoration formula for fallen lineage with the completed ideal it was intended to restore. From this theological perspective, using the Cain-Abel framework to challenge Dr. Moon's providential position reverses the very principle it claims to defend. Regarding the comment that, quote, Reverend Moon never called Hyunjanim the fourth Adam, read the Family Federation inauguration speech and the holy text. There is only one heir that Reverend Moon acknowledges, which is Dr. Moon, the fourth Adam. In Dr. Moon's inaugural speech in 1998, Reverend Moon did not talk about a vice presidency or an organizational chart. You must read the unadulterated original Korean speech, not Peter Kim's faulty translation. That translation reflected the agenda of UC leaders who sought to redefine Reverend Moon's words by implying that all members stood in the position of the fourth Adam, thereby obscuring the unique providential role that Reverend Moon acknowledged. By making the fourth Adam into a generalized designation rather than a singular providential person, they opened the door to questioning the issue of succession, something Reverend Moon himself had already settled. In that sense, these distortions became the vehicle through which Satan cast doubt on Dr. Moon's Adamic position and his succession. But let it be clear that Reverend Moon spoke about his son, Dr. Moon, in providential and messianic terms. He said, after severing ties with Satan's lineage and clearing it away, you must understand how amazing it is that now God's direct son is inheriting the baton to begin the victorious realm of the fourth Adam, centered upon his family. Only Hyunjin's children are the fourth generation. They are the fourth generation. That's why you can receive the era of the fourth Adam through Hyunjin's family. Reverend Moon's words at Dr. Moon's inauguration, 1998. Sean, Kukjin, Mrs. Han, and UC leaders ignored Reverend Moon's directive and understanding that all personnel serve at the direction of the Adamic figure. Reverend Moon instructed that any new appointments in the age of the children or age of the second generation take place within the auspices of and at the direction of the fourth Adam. But Shan and Kukjin, under the influence of UC clerics, showed no intention of being under the realm of the fourth Adam. This is despite the fact that during Shan's inauguration as international president of the Family Federation in 2008, Reverend Moon gave a speech and prayer where he drove home the point 16 times that Shan's position was within the realm of the fourth Adam. Although Dr. Moon himself held the comparatively modest organizational title of vice president within the Family Federation, while figures such as Reverend Kwok and Sunjo Huang served as international president. In our movement's providential worldviews, those administrative titles were ultimately secondary. They reflected organizational responsibilities, not one's spiritual standing or providential position. In Reverend Moon's eyes, Dr. Moon's siblings were merely taking on symbolic, managerial, administrative roles within the confines of existing organizations. These clerical-type positions always worked within the auspices of the Adamic figure, who has ultimate spiritual authority over the movement. Both Reverend Kwok and Huang recognized and submitted to Dr. Moon's Adamic authority. Reverend Moon's expectation was that Shan would align to Adamic authority and follow Dr. Moon. However, Shan and Kukjin resented their brother's special providential status and aimed to subvert Dr. Moon. To this day, sanctuary cult members look at Shan's inaugural ceremony as a moment when he was somehow legitimized by Reverend Moon, when in truth, it is the moment that Reverend Moon requested Shan to work under the direction of his elder brother, Dr. Moon, to advance God's providence. Reverend Moon never asked or expected Shan to usurp or to claim successorship status through his inauguration. Shan insists that he is the successor of Reverend Moon, while claiming a non-existent position of King of Cheonilguk. There has never been any king of Cheonilguk, because Chunilguk itself was not established. The settlement of God's sovereignty and the settlement of the true parents and true family come through Foundation Day. But there has been no Foundation Day. Reverend Moon's teachings on God's sovereignty and kingship are centered on father and son cooperation that opens the path to Chunilguk. That cooperation was not that of Reverend Moon with Shan and Kukchin, but it was the cooperation of the third Adam with the fourth Adam. That is, the cooperation and work between the two Adamic figures in the true family. Reverend Moon only recognized 4 Adamic figures: Adam, Jesus, Reverend Moon, and Dr. Hyunjin Moon. The reason that Reverend Moon emphasized the era of the realm of the fourth Adam after Dr. Moon's 1998 inauguration was to highlight how central Dr. Moon was to establishing the proper framework of father and son cooperation to bring about the new providential era of Chunilguk. Shan was never an equal to Dr. Moon. Shan was never recognized as an Adamic figure. Further, Shan's character, actions, his complete ignorance of the principle and God's providence, and his panoply of lies and contradictory positions represent how illegitimate he is. His lack of merit in front of heaven and humanity puts him the farthest away from any position of spiritual authority. But all of this was lost on you because you were clueless about the context. Regarding the Quack group smear, sanctuary members have remarkably short memories. They refuse to remember the pain and suffering that Shan and Kukchin caused. One of their favorite attacks was using the Quack group label. Shan and Kukchin invented it during the schism as a slur, and they used it mercilessly against blessed central families while they were in control. The whole point of the label was to imply that Reverend Quack somehow controlled Dr. Moon, that Dr. Moon is really just Hyunjin Quack. Think about it. This lie is close to the worst thing a younger brother can say about his older brother, in effect, denying his brother's family ties. These two went so far as to remove Dr. Moon's entire family from the list of bereaved family members when Reverend Moon passed away. That was an attempt to erase his family from the historical record and deny his heritage. What kind of person does something like that to his own brother? Kukchin and Shan will definitely pay a spiritual price for that. There will be a reckoning between them and Dr. Moon over this because the insult is that outrageous. Shan and Kukchin manufactured a version of Reverend Quack that never existed. They painted him as some Rasputin-like figure pulling the strings, when the reality is that Reverend Quack never held that kind of influence over anyone, and he has shown Dr. Moon nothing but reverence and deference from the beginning. That portrait is outlandish, and it does not match a single fact. So where does it actually come from? From Kukchin's own personal grudge. It traces back to his resentment of Reverend Quack from the days when a young Kukchin, fresh out of college, worked under Reverend Quack at the Tongil Foundation. That is the root of it, a petty, vindictive wound that he never let go of. Even sanctuary people admit that Reverend Moon himself could not control Dr. Moon. So how was Reverend Quack supposed to do so. The Kwak Group label came from Sean and Kuchin, and it speaks much more about their character than anything else. I will now address the comments claiming that Yunjanim's side is stuck in the past, that we are just complaining. On dwelling in the past, you cannot understand the present collapse of the Unification Church without the history that produced it. When people are lied to long enough, the lie hardens into their truth, and the only way to break it is to lay the record out in the open, so members finally see the ground they are actually standing on, and then can move to the correct center. Those few who are commenting that there's no vision are only demonstrating how lazy and ignorant they are. They cannot even be bothered to do the research about all the early work that Dr. Moon did in reforming the movement and his accomplishments during the schism while being betrayed by most of you. Despite all the accusations and attacks, Dr. Moon remains steadfast on the path to advance God's providence and has continued the work of his Father. The positive vision you have not been able to see has always been in play. That vision is on the long public record, and the door to it is always open. And to those who posted that we are stuck in the past and can only complain, Dr. Moon is very much forward-looking and future-oriented. While the church institution spent itself in courts and on deifying Mrs. Han, and now on defending itself against criminal charges, Dr. Moon was building the movement across 5 continents with the scraps that were left to him. Dr. Moon stayed true to God's providence and is achieving success that the movement never saw, even in Father Moon's own time. Reverend Moon's most essential life goals connected to God's providence are now being fulfilled by Dr. Moon. Take just one example, the peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. 16 years ago, when Dr. Moon first introduced the Korean Dream framework, reunification had become a dead issue. Today, Dr. Moon leads the largest grassroots coalition for a unified Korea in South Korean history, engaging Koreans in the South, in the North, and across the diaspora. Even former opponents of Reverend Moon, through the foundation Dr. Moon has built, are coming to understand Reverend Moon's vision and joining in partnership to build a free and unified Korea. Korean society has taken notice. Yunhap TV produced a documentary series tracking Dr. Moon's work for a unified Korea and his global peace-building efforts. Chosun TV aired a 2-part news special on the historic reunification event at the 38th parallel. KBS, Korea's oldest and most influential network, broadcast the Korean Dream event on the Han River, marking the 80th anniversary of liberation. Then reran it, then produced a 1-hour special compiling highlights of Dr. Moon's speech and the night that reignited hope for a unified Korea. Most recently, Donghae Ilbo, one of Korea's most prestigious newspapers, with roots going back to the independence movement itself, published a 300-page book on Dr. Moon's life and his work entitled Korean Dream, An Audacious Journey. This is unprecedented. Donghae does not produce such a huge volume, even for presidents or other historical figures of Korea. But they made a book of Dr. Moon and his work because they believe that he is that consequential for the future of the Republic. The book traces 4 generations of the Moon family's contributions, from great-granduncle Yoon Guk Moon's central role in the independence movement to Reverend Moon's brave visit to Kim Il-sung that opened the way for divided families to reunite. The Korea media itself is now carrying Dr. Moon's vision to the citizens because they recognize who has done the most to fulfill the aspirations of the independence movement. And the Korean dream is only one front. In Paraguay, Dr. Moon has developed a roadmap for national transformation grounded in principles and values. In Nigeria and Kenya, the vision of one family under God has become the very instrument for mitigating post-election violence and healing ethnic and religious tensions. In the Philippines, the nation's largest mall enterprise partners with Dr. Moon's organizations to run one of the premier ongoing youth leadership summits in the nation. All across the world, the work to build one family under God continues, advancing Heavenly Father's dream. The work is documented publicly if you have eyes to see. So, these are the answers to the repetitive negative comments, all here for your reference. To the sincere members who are still sorting through these issues, keep asking your questions. You are one of the main reasons these videos exist. There are still very sincere people within the larger unification movement who were misled by the clerics, the cabal, and the people who fomented the schism. Many of you were victimized by it, and many are still trying to understand what really happened. For your honest questions, I will always make room. You can send your questions and comments to the email address shown here on the screen. But to the rest, to the people regurgitating the same talking points, protecting indicted leaders, hiding in corrupt organizations or fringe cults, I have now responded. I am not going to keep answering these comments one by one. These videos are not for you. We do not need you, and we are not trying to recruit you. The hard truth is this: for many longtime members, the providence has already moved on. The door may still be open, but the boat has passed by. We tried many times and in earnest for years now to convey the truth. But many have chosen loyalty to the Unification Church over God's providence. Many carried the wrong kind of baggage for so long that they lost the sincerity, humility, and spiritual sensitivity needed to recognize where the providence is moving today. That is a paradox of the last days. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. The movement Dr. Moon is leading is not trapped inside the old Unification Church box. In fact, it has nothing to do with it. Its future, as I have said, is with new Greenfield people of sincere faith, people who are without self-promoting agendas, who can receive heaven's calling with fresh hearts, and who are willing to build God's dream without the corruption, pride, and fallen habits that became the hallmarks of the UC. For those who were part of that old system, the only honest path forward is a redemptive one: to acknowledge where you failed, where you were misled, and where you betrayed God's providence. Do not delude yourselves. Terrible judgment is now falling upon the Unification Church, and that is not an accident. It is the consequence of going against God's will. But God's providence will always continue. That is why anti-liars exist. We do this because Dr. Moon asked us to be keepers of our brothers and sisters. We do this to clear the fog created by the schism makers for those who still love Reverend Moon, still seek the truth, and still want to understand how his movement was hijacked, and more importantly, how it is being restored. That is where my focus will remain, and that focus will be reflected in every future episode of Anti-Liars, where we always seek the truth and expose the lies, and point sincere people toward the providence that heaven is advancing today. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Please stay tuned for the next episode of Anti-Liars, where we promise to always seek the truth and dispel the lies. May God bless you and your family.